I'm hoping that
Sorry, Kirti.
Oh, no problem. I'm hoping that we can, kind of finish off with you having, somewhat of a grasp of the seasons here in the low desert, because that really is just as important as good watering practices and also that soil preparation that is critical for most of our traditional vegetables that we're interested in growing. So we were, we talked about those aspects yesterday, and we started in on the cool season plants. So I'd like to continue with those. Here we have chard. Swiss chard is just a fabulous grower for the cool season. It has a long growing season. You can start this even as early as September. If it is kept somewhat cool in your garden, that nice little microclimate, you could even still be harvesting your chard as late as May, sometimes even into June. It can take a little bit of heat, more so than a lot of the other leafy greens that we plant in our gardens during the cool season. The great thing about chard is it's so photogenic. Just the colors that are available are wonderful. The most standard is green leafed with a white stem. You may be familiar with the Ford hook, chard and so forth, but there are some fun colors, just a nice wide array. For many people, this fools them. With the red chard, they think, oh, you can grow rhubarb here in the desert. No, it's kind of a somewhat of a rhubarb lookalike, but that's our red chard. There are some that have beautiful yellow or golden stems. These can easily be grown in containers. As I said, if you want to try to get anything growing into more of the warm season, always go with a large pot. My recommendation is a pot that's about 2 feet in width, and that gives you a good soil base that maintains moisture longer and stays cooler when we really start getting into the high temperatures. But what a lovely, very ornamental, colorful planter this is with the chard. So for the cool season, I forgot to mention, we want to maximize the hours of direct sun. Because our days are shorter, temperatures are milder, we really want to maximize the amount of direct sun these vegetables are receiving. So it would be like in higher elevations, more northern gardening situations where they get perhaps, a good 6 or 8 hours of sunlight that can, really help things grow. That's pretty much what we have in the winter. So plant your winter garden in a place that will get the maximum amount of sun. In addition to the chard, the world of kale is so fun also. Colorful, a lot of different textures that we have available to us. With our boars, we have star boar and red boar, that just real frilly textural kale, and our old standard red Russian and green Russian that have been around, great heirloom varieties. And speaking of heirloom does not mean that it's genetically modified. Heirloom means it's open pollinated. For the most part, most often, things are open pollinated and they've been grown for decades and decades. So they're heirloom in respect that, they've been favored for many, many years as good, strong growers, good producers, great tasters for our table. So, and then we have hybrids. And just because seed or a plant is hybrid does not mean that it's genetically modified. It just means that plant breeders have done a little bit of crossing, direct crossing with our plants to give us some good outcomes. We have a lot of hybrid tomatoes. One of my favorites is the great little orange one, the golden cherry that is so sweet. It's almost like candy. Well, that's a hybrid. So it doesn't mean that it's genetically modified. So don't be afraid to use any of those vegetable plants that are hybrids. The only thing is you can't save the seed and plant it again the next year unless you're just one who wants surprises. From a hybrid seed that would germinate from plants that you harvest from, you'll have variation in the offspring that you don't normally see in just general open pollinated plants. Okay, back on track, Kirti. This is a wonderful kale. I mentioned yesterday that I started gardening from a very young age. My mother and grandmother got me involved in, growing the vegetables, the flowers and things. And I think it's important that we encourage young people to garden and, use any way that you can to lure them into the process, and they'll easily get hooked once they get started and see how fun it is. I think one of the best things to grow in your garden for youngsters is dinosaur kale. Who could resist eating their dinosaur kale? Not only is it fun to grow, but then this encourages young people to eat vegetables as well. It just has this cool color and texture, I guess, that reminded somebody of dinosaur hides. So it's a wonderful long producing plant. You can see the stem elongates, and you can just keep harvesting leaves through the season, and it will keep producing new growth, new leaves from this center portion at the top of the stem. And this is what youngsters would look like of the dinosaur kale. Spinach, it's a cool season grower. Cool season, does not like heat. Many people get discouraged and, lament, what did I do wrong? My spinach didn't grow as it was supposed to, it bolted. So bolting is a term that we use when a plant before its time is triggered to get a production of flowers and eventually seed. Something triggers it, it has a response of that, I need to finish my life cycle because the end is near. A little heat spike during the winter, an 80-degree day or two could make your spinach bolt. So we have absolutely no control over that. There are a few varieties available that are slightly more tolerant of warmer temperatures, but overall spinach doesn't like warm weather. So when you see it elongating, such as this, you can see this real tight growth. If you're looking down in the center and the stem starts to elongate, that's bolting. So you don't want to try to harvest after it begins bolting, because most likely the flavor will not be desirable. And what a way to ruin a salad by throwing a few bad leaves in. These are the seedlings of the spinach, the cotyledons, those seed leaves, and the true leaves emerging here. French sorrel. Most of the vegetables that we grow are considered annuals. They start from seed, grow, develop, flower, and produce more seed, all within one season. So they complete their life cycles within a year, with an annual cycle. Perennials grow more than 2 years. There are a few, not very many, but there are some vegetables that are biennials. It takes them 2 years to develop to maturity. So the first year they primarily have just growth, and then the second year they would complete their growth, flower, and produce seeds and die. Perennials, we usually count on them being around for a good many years. Sorrel is a delightful, tangy leafed plant that I do recommend. Its main growing period is during the winter, during the cool season. If you keep it in an area of your garden that will remain a little more cool during the summer, that helps it to keep going from one year to the next. what we have to remember when we're working with perennials in our garden is, since they will be there for years, you want to designate a portion, a spot in your garden, whether it be kind of the end of your planting area or, someplace that we can have it grow for many years and not really impede or interrupt activities through the rest of the garden, as far as changing from one season to another for your planting of the annuals. Cabbages are cool season growers. So they're in that group that we refer to as coles, C-O-L-E-S. We have different varieties of cabbage that we can grow. Starting your plants from seed offers a great opportunity to grow some wild and crazy things. If we go to even a really good nursery, we will be limited with the selection of the vegetables. They might have, 3 or 4 types of tomatoes, or, a couple of this or that, as far as varieties. But when you start going through seed catalogs, your mind will be blown if you haven't done that before, because there are so many cool, fun looking different varieties. When you are going through seed catalogs, just keep in mind, particularly for the information regarding sun exposure, if it is especially a warm season grower, when it says full sun, we may need to do some translation to fine tune that to the exposure we'd want for it in our desert garden. So the cabbage, we have our standard, green cabbage, the purple cabbages. There are some that have kind of a pointy head. There are all kinds of fun cabbages. And generally, what do we look for in the market? We want a nice, big, firm head. So we do need to let the cabbage pretty much mature completely before we harvest it. Cauliflower, another cole, is another cool season grower. So for these types of plants, especially the cauliflower, it takes up a lot of room. You can expect it to, just kind of burst out in growth and take up even up to 2 feet in space in your garden. So make sure that you allot enough room between the plants for them to grow successfully. What you could do, if you're growing these plants that will eventually take up a lot of space, while they're still real small, you could fill that space between individual plants with fast maturing things like radishes. And that way you can maximize your harvest from the space you have available. Now, evidently, from what I've heard, there are some varieties available these days that you don't need to, really shelter the flower bud head. So our cauliflower, this is a flower bud that we eat, or a head, a grouping of flower buds. But for the most part, I would recommend you gather up the big leaves when that little head starts to develop. Gather up the leaves, tie them, and that it blanches. It keeps that head nice and white and very tender. So as to the validity of varieties being available that you don't need to cover like that, I'm really not sure. There are, purple cauliflowers, just all kinds of crazy things available these days. So have some fun. The broccoli is another one. Now, what do we harvest? When we want to purchase a head of broccoli, we want a head that's nice and tight. If these flower buds really start to develop more and get plump, or when they start to loosen from each other, it's better to just leave it and let it flower. And you can actually eat the flowers of your broccoli, but it's not best to harvest it when it starts getting really loose. You want it nice and tight. Don't cut too loose or too low when you harvest your broccoli. If you cut the main head off and leave the rest of the stem, you will get some more little broccoli heads develop. Of course, they won't be as large as the original center head, but they'll be tender, they'll be very tasty, and you can have some continued harvest. We can also eat the younger leaves of the broccoli plant. They're very tasty also. And the flowers, when you do let things like this bloom, the flowers are good at attracting pollinators and beneficial insects of different types. Smaller and a little tangier than regular broccoli, you might want to try some broccoli rabe. It's a plant that kind of gets taller and branches some, and the little tiny tender heads of these flower buds are what we would harvest. And they are, as I say, they're very tasty. They have a little bit of a tanginess, a little bit of hotness to them compared to regular broccoli. So it'd be great for stir fries and things. There are a lot of different choys, bok choy, pak choy, joy choy. These greens are fabulous to use in so many different ways. They are a little susceptible to prematurely bolting, almost as bad as the spinach is. So we get a little too hot during this cool season, they may send up a bloom stalk, but don't worry. You could eat some of those flowers, but also they're very good for attracting pollinators. Here's a great example of a lettuce that's bolting towards the end of the season. So don't think, oh, I can harvest the young, more tender leaves. They will be bitter. And usually it's not a good bitter. There are greens that we eat intentionally for their bitterness, the radicchio and things like that. But this is just a nasty bitter, I'd say. So leave the flowers to attract pollinators and beneficial insects. It will help control bad insects. Carrots. I would really recommend that if you're doing your gardening in the ground, unless you are absolutely sure that you've worked that soil and loosened it deep enough, I would recommend the varieties of carrots that mature to maybe 6 or 8 inches in length, rather than those that want to get a foot long. To get that long, they need to have really nice, loose soil. If you're working with raised beds and you can be a little bit more sure that the soil is loose to that depth, then that's a little bit different. But we have a wide range of carrots available. And certainly carrots, they're one of those vegetables that have seed that's quite small. Not the smallest, but still pretty small. With small seed, it's more of a challenge to get the seed spaced perfectly so that you don't have to thin. So most likely you will need to thin your carrot seedlings once they start popping up. You're going to need to leave a few inches in between them. We want to have enough space for your carrots to get nice and plump. They can't do that if they're too close to each other. Radishes, so many selections of radishes. This is probably the most popular for getting youngsters involved in growing because, well, just like a lot of us adults, many young gardeners have short attention span, and something that like a radish that would mature in perhaps as little as 25 days, that's going to keep the momentum going. They can keep going and checking the calendar and checking the radishes for that long, but something that will take 90 days to mature, that's a little more of a challenge maybe. The radishes, it's another one. We have to make sure that they have sufficient space in between individuals so that they can mature. And these seedlings are super tasty. They will be tangy, spicy, just like radishes are. If you are thinning, then have that basket or tray handy. Just clip them with your little scissors and toss them into your tray and sprinkle on your salad for the evening. A fun thing is, once radishes, you leave some to allow them to flower. Those flowers are very tasty as well. You can sprinkle them in salads for a little color and pizzazz. The little seed pods that start to develop, while they're still green, they'll be kind of crunchy, and they too will be very tangy. You can eat those. That's before they really start maturing and turning tan, getting dried out. So in addition to the rapid growth and development of your radishes, some of the varieties are really fun, like purple plum. A lot of kids will be interested in growing and harvesting those purple plums from the ground. They have a lovely purplish color. And Rudolph, very nice round, bright red radishes. The English breakfast. This variety it's one of those heirlooms. It's been around for so long. It's just a good, consistent grower with great flavor. And they're kind of two-toned and elongated. So many types of radishes we can choose from. Beets. Beets are so fun to grow. The young leaves, we can harvest a few of them from each plant. Don't go overboard. Now, we always have to remember everything in our garden and everything in our landscape. Our plants depend on their foliage to allow for the process of photosynthesis, which makes the food for the plant, for the parts above ground as well as for the root system below ground. If we clip off way too many leaves off of a beet plant, it won't be able to produce, it won't be making enough food for itself to have a really nice, beefy, plump beet to harvest. But harvesting a few from each plant is fine. The leaves, these young tender leaves, we can eat them raw in salads, or we can saute them or steam them a little bit like you would spinach. A lot of different ways we can use them, and they're very tasty, very nutritious. And beets aren't just red. There are beets that might fool you, and you think, is that a carrot? No, it doesn't have the right leaves for a carrot. That is a beet, a beautiful golden beet. There are some beets that have red and white stripes inside. That can be fun to encourage kids to eat. There are vegetables, and oh boy, here's another good one for the youngsters, bull's blood beets. What a fun beet to grow. The entire plant is this beautiful red color, maroon, the foliage and the stems, as well as the beet itself. Onions are cool season growers. If you would like to grow these head onions and bulbing onions and have them mature, you're going to plant them in October, and they aren't going to be fully mature to harvest until around May or perhaps even June, depending on the type of the onion. So they do need to be in a location in your garden where they won't be in the way for you to go ahead and amend the soil and get your warm season veggies that go in around March to get them going. So just keep that in mind. And you don't have to let them mature to a full onion bulb. You could harvest them before that. Bunching onions, or there's also green onions. They mature more quickly. This is a fabulous bunching onions. On your handout, I have a few nurseries or a few seed catalogs listed. One of them is Native Seed Search. They are based in Tucson, and they have seed that is, they offer a lot of heirloom plants, seed of things that have been grown here for hundreds of years, if not actually native to this region. And this is one, the Ethoi bunching onions were brought up from the South as certain people came through in our Southwest region here. And the some of our local tribes decided they were fabulous, And they are great cool season growers. You can harvest these young leaves at any time as they're developing. They have like a nice strong chive flavor. The bulbs can be harvested when they are partially mature. They tend to be kind of pink in color, or you can leave them till the end of the season when the leaves start to dry up, harvest them, and they'll be larger and have that little kind of brown or tan papery covering on them. And you could even store those to the next season. Something like this, I would always keep a couple of those bulbs to plant the next season. I usually like throw them in the back of my crisper in the fridge so that they're out of the way, but kept at a cool temperature. And when it's appropriate, the next September, I can pull them out and plant them. The bulbs themselves have a really delightful shallot-like flavor that is wonderful to use in so many different ways. So these are the plants at the end of the season. Those leaves start to dry up, and that's when you can pull up the bulbs that could be stored or eaten at any time. And they also produce gorgeous flowers. Potatoes, cool season growers. We want to have a really nice loose soil for the potatoes to be able to grow good size and be easy to harvest. Raised bed situations are great because you can have that really nice loose soil. This is a system. It's a plastic sheet that is just closed into a cylinder. It has holes for some of the stems to grow out of on the sides here as well as out of the top. So you can fill this with really nice rich soil. At the end of the season, you open up this plastic sheet, and then that soil can just drop and spread, and you can easily pull those potatoes out of the soil there without damaging any of them. When I was a kid, it would always be so disheartening, just crushing in the ground as you're trying to dig up the tubers at the end of the season when you slice through some of them with the shovel. It's like so disappointing. They're not that perfect potato coming out of the ground. So raised beds or something like this can avoid that situation. Artichokes. These are just fabulous plants. They are gorgeous. They are huge. An artichoke can easily get to be about 5 foot wide and tall in one season. They're perennials. This is another one you really need to have some nice space set aside that will accommodate them at the peak of their growth. Now, they are sometimes kind of tricky. Again, this is one, people ask, well, how do I know when to harvest it? We're generally looking for a nice tight bud. What we're eating is the flower bud. When we purchase an artichoke, if it starts to loosen, leave it. It's going to be kind of tough and stringy, not the best flavor or eating. Leave it and let it do this. The flowers are stupendous on the artichoke. And some people even cut these just as they're approaching their peak, and cut them and dry them and use them in arrangements that can last for quite a long time. And plus, these flowers attract butterflies, pollinators of all types, beneficial insects. So just keep that in mind. So we usually harvest the artichokes in April, I'd say. Then after the harvesting season, the plants start to get really scruffy and scraggly, leaves dry up. And what you can do is cut the stem back. Some people like to, leave 6 or 8 inches or so to really be able to make it noticeable so you don't dig in that area and damage the root system. But you could cut it lower to just a couple of inches above the ground. Leave it for the summer. Often by mid-September, it will start to pop up from the soil with new growth to start that cycle to get to be huge, 5 foot tall and wide all over again. For our cool season growers, we may need to offer some protection. Most susceptible to a freeze, to frost damage would be very young plants. If we have a very, very early freeze, that can really do probably, I'd say, the most damage in our gardens because plants haven't gotten really well established and mature to sustain in colder temperatures. If you need to cover your plants, a few things to keep in mind. You want to cover them by mid or at least by late afternoon, if possible, and cover your plants to trap that afternoon heat, the warmest air of the day, in around the plants. You want that cover to go all the way to the ground. That will also trap any heat that's radiating up from below the plants from the soil overnight. If we bunch the cover up around the plant, yes, you've got warm air in here, but we don't have that added benefit of the radiating heat overnight, keeping that plant a little bit more toasty warm. You could use old sheets and things, but remember, lazy gardener, that confession I've made a few times. Frost cloth is fabulous. It is lightweight. We could actually throw it right on top of the plants. It weighs nothing, so it won't crush the plants with its weight. Or we could have some type of a framework that would support the covering as well. Either way is fine. Most often what we find in our area is a product called Insulate. You have to have a catchy name for your product, right? But it's a cloth that allows about 70% of the sunlight to penetrate. So ideal for the lazy gardener, because if there are a few nights or even a week of cold nights that are predicted, that are forecast, I can cover the plants and leave them covered for a week. They'll still be receiving sufficient sunlight to keep photosynthesizing, to keep growing without me having to uncover them. Sheets are too heavy, not sufficient light can get through. So you would need to go out after danger of frost, maybe around 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock in the morning, and remove your covers so that the plants will receive enough light to function properly, and then cover them up again in the afternoon. I am too lazy to do that, so I go for the frost cloth. You can purchase packets. I believe they're 10 foot by 12 foot in these packages. Some of our local nurseries carry this in bulk, so they'll have a big roll of it that you can pull off, as many feet or yards of this material as you need, and that can be very economical if you have large spaces to cover. And that material usually lasts a good few years, especially if you store it out of the sunlight during the summer. That would be critical to maintain that. It's a plastic product, a synthetic product that if it's in the sunlight consistently, year round, it will degrade within a year or two. So fold it up and tuck it away in your garage or something for the summer so it's not in the sun. There are frames. You can make them out of PVC or wood, all kinds of methods you can use to create a support to make a tent over your bed, and you could just put that frost cloth right over it and make sure it's secure so that if we have winds overnight, there won't be flapping, so that we don't want the cold air mixing in to the warm air in our cover. These supports, we can use them for frost cloth, and we can also use them to protect plants in the summer. So we could leave them year round or just put them up when needed. this is a really nice system. These folks had a huge raised planter. I think it was about 6 foot wide, and oh my gosh, it must have been about 12 foot in length or so. They created this PVC frame that they put up for the winter. If you look here, here's the drape. Easily, 2 people, one on either side, could grab this and just run it down the length of the beds. They would secure it with some nice flat rocks. And, you know, within a matter of 2 minutes, you have your bed covered to protect it from cold overnight. Some people will use burlap. That's all right too. I wouldn't suggest old sheets or burlap be placed directly on plants because it does weigh more than that frost cloth. So we don't want to have the potential for crushing any plants. So a lot of plants, once they really get growing, are definitely more cold hardy. They're able to maintain and be fine with colder temperatures, but usually it's that early frost, and say sometime in November, that can most often cause damage for our plants. And just be a little bit aware of which of the vegetables are like super cold hardy. You wouldn't need to worry about them at all, or those that you would need to put on the list to run out and cover if needed. But you will have to remove the burlap every day to allow enough sunlight to get in for your plants to function. Do not create a little mini greenhouse by covering your plants with plastic. Any of these leaves that the plastic is in contact with will be very susceptible to burn from the cold temperatures. So this is different. If you have the well supported so that the frame is, you have good space between the plastic and the plants, then that's different. But don't try to put plastic right over the plants. They will very often suffer burn. And most likely you have to remove this during the day. You don't want to protect your plants overnight and then bake them during the day. It will be like a little greenhouse and get very warm, sometimes too warm. So those are the cool season growers. Remember, the leafy vegetables, the root crops, particularly, and then the peas are our main cool season growers. So a lot of these we can start planting in October, some even as early as September, and keep planting. Some of them we could even be planting a last round in February, or perhaps even March, depending on what it is and how fast it matures. So that brings us into our warm season. Our spring planting, I would say we have within the warm season a spring planting time and monsoon planting time. And for some of our vegetables, you could plant both in the spring and then during the summer with the onset of the monsoon season. But in general, some of our things we can start planting in mid-February, or at least by early March to mid-April. So that's the main window for planting the majority of our warm season growers. For the monsoon, July to mid-August would be the target time for planting in conjunction with the monsoon. Now, we had talked about the temperature. For the cool season, sometimes we have to wait because the seed just won't germinate if the soil is too warm. For the warm season growers, sometimes we have to wait because the soil is too cold. You could help expedite the warming of the soil by covering it with some dark plastic. But just remember, you can't leave that plastic in place. Once the soil gets warmed up enough, then remove that plastic. Okay, I cheated. This is actually at the Arboretum at Flagstaff in one of their vegetable gardens, but it's a good display of what we could do to preheat our soil. If you really get into the intricacies of temperatures, I would suggest that you get a soil thermometer. It is a thermometer, usually it's a glass thermometer that has a metal tip and backside casing to it to protect it so it won't break. But the metal tip is usually about 1 inch in length. And what you would want to do is put your thermometer in the soil about to the depth that the seed would be planted. So overall, very small seed, we only plant maybe 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch deep. The larger the seed, the deeper we would plant it. Most of the seed packets, as we saw last night, have the proper depth for planting. But what do you do if a friend just, gives you, shares with you some of their seed that they harvested? And we're kind of like, well, where's the little chart on the envelope? You can make a really fairly educated guess. The larger the seed, the deeper it's going to go. And we have a rule of thumb that you plant the seed at a depth that's about 2 to 3 times the width of the seed. Something like a pea seed, you're going to plant that a good 1 inch to 1.5 inches or so into the soil. Fava beans, about 2 inches deep. If you're planting garlic, you want to put those garlic cloves a good 1.5 inches or maybe even 2 inches deep into the soil. But this is going to allow you to be aware of the temperature of the soil at the depth that your seed will be planted so you can accommodate its needs. Some people, to get a little head start, might use something like a cold frame. This is a device where you can have it open during the day and then close it late in the afternoon to trap the warm air in. The next day, after late, kind of mid-morning, after danger of frost has passed, then you would open it back up for good air circulation and so that you won't get the plants too hot. Some people use these little devices called a wallow water. It is a sheet of plastic that is basically, it's like one big sheet that's folded in half lengthwise and sealed into a ring, kind of probably heat sealed. And then between those 2 layers of plastic, about every 2 inches or so, heat sealed. So you have a series of tubes that are open at the top of this overall circle of plastic. You fill those tubes with water, each one of them. During the day, they will absorb heat from the sun, and that energy will be radiated off overnight to keep your plants warm. Now, tomatoes, we start indoors late December or early January in some nice warm soil indoors. And when we plant them out, we want them to be as big as possible, as robust, to really take off. Some people love to just, I guess I shouldn't say play with fire because we're talking about cold here. But some people like to get their tomatoes out, by mid-February or perhaps early February. You risk danger of a cold snap if you do that. Some people get lucky. But if you do plant your tomatoes or very tender plants like that and cold is expected, you could use something like these wallow waters to plant or put around individual plants to keep them warm. Water jugs, you could get gallon jugs, fill them with water and set them around your plants. Same concept. The water absorbs the heat during the day and radiates it at night. But you do need to protect tomatoes, young tomatoes, from cold temperatures. Well, it seems like we're worried about a late freeze, and before we know it, we're faced with heat. It just happens in a blink of the eye in the warm season. So you need to be very aware of what can happen with your plants once we really start to get into the warm season, the hot season. This is a really sad looking eggplant. Pardon me. I can't look at this in the afternoon, maybe 2 or 3 in the afternoon. I can't look at this and assume that I need to go turn on the hose or hit the irrigation controller to run a cycle, I need to go out and check the moisture in the soil. There are some nice, very reasonably priced little soil moisture meters that you could use, but we all have several moisture meters that we carry around with us all the time. Go poke around the soil. During the summer, when our plants are droopy in the afternoon, they could be suffering from water stress. If we start poking around and maybe half an inch deep, geez, that soil's dry. We go a little bit deeper, an inch deep, and we can still barely detect any moisture. That soil is dry. We need to get water into the soil. So that plant would be suffering from water stress. On the other hand, if we go down half an inch and there's moisture there, an inch deep, and that's nice moisture, go even deeper and it might be almost too wet, that plant is suffering from heat stress. This occurs during the summer. The leaves on our plants have, we could think of them as pores that are open during the sunlight hours. So these pores, the stomata, they're open and they allow for an exchange of gases. CO2 can enter the leaf tissue to be utilized in the process of photosynthesis. And the byproduct of photosynthesis, one of them is oxygen. So oxygen can leave through those stomata. Moisture also leaves through those pores. When we are thinking about June, pre-monsoon, we might have 8% humidity and, that hot, dry breeze in the afternoon. It's like it's just wicking the moisture out of the leaves. And in this situation, there's sufficient moisture in the soil, but the roots can't absorb it and pump it up through the vascular system of your plant fast enough to compensate for the moisture that's lost through the leaf tissue. So we get this droopiness. Check about an hour after sunset, you will probably see these plants start to perk back up. And that is an indication that the roots, they keep pumping moisture out of the soil and sending it up. But now that those pores close after the sun sets, the roots can get caught up with delivering the moisture to the leaf tissues. And so you'll see that reviving. The turgor pressure, returns to those leaves. So if you check with your moisture meter and there is moisture in the soil, do not add more water. What you could do is saturate the soil with water, and that is not good. We need air in the soil, as well as the moisture for the root systems to function properly. We need that air because they have to have oxygen to carry on respiration. If we saturate the soil with water, the next day the plant will look droopy. And if we don't check, we'll put more water into the soil. Before we know it, we've killed our eggplant with kindness by basically suffocating and rotting the root system. So always check. It's mainly a problem, a challenge during the summer months. Usually if your plant looks kind of droopy during the winter, most likely it's from water stress, but still check. It's a good practice to use year-round. What can we do if our plants are suffering from heat stress? Well, we could make sure that there's a nice mulch on the soil surface. That will help keep the soil cooler. And overall, it's just a nice habit to get into of using a mulch layer on your vegetable garden for the summer months, a good inch or so thick. And that is a buffer. It's like an insulator. It helps slow the rate of evaporation of moisture from the actual soil and also keeps the soil a little cooler down in the root zone. So it can help in both of those ways. Another really good thing to do for plants that suffer with heat stress is offer them a little shade during those summer months. And that, they'll stay a little cooler, so that might help kind of cut the amount of the transpiration, the loss of the moisture from the leaf tissues. And that can help overall with those plants that are especially susceptible to heat stress. Providing shade from trees is also a nice thing to do if you have trees, nice desert trees that offer a light shade, not a dense shade. But remember, we want to try to be careful and not have our vegetable plantings too near the main roots of a big tree, because we don't want that tree being subjected to that continually moist soil.
Hey, Kirti.
Yes.
Real quick, someone is asking if you could just if you could re-explain how to get air into the soil.
When we're preparing our soil for planting, if the soil is compacted at all, it's a good thing. You can use what we call a digging fork. It's like a big giant fork. The tines on it are wider than a pitchfork. But that's a good thing. You can just pop it down, push it down into the soil, and pull back a little bit to loosen the soil. If you want to grow and using that kind of no-till method, that can help get air into the soil, but you're not turning it actually. Or if you don't adhere to that no-till, just as you're mixing your soil with some organic matter from season to season, that helps loosen it. And that is how we get the good air to easily penetrate the soil system. So I hope that, explained it.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So, our Palo Verde, our mesquite, our ironwood trees, they have, tough roots. They can grow through that, somewhat compacted clay soil even, that is our desert environment in so many areas of the valley. But our little vegetables, they need a loose soil. So that's very important for them. Yeah. Now, shade. Okay. This is really, really, really important, everybody. If you want to provide a little bit of that artificial shade to keep your plants more comfortable, once we really get into the heat of summer, look for what we refer to as shade cloth that is rated from about 30 to 50 or 60%. Many of our big box stores, the shade cloth that they have is for the comfort of humans and pets. It is too dense for plants to be able to function properly. I purchased some shade cloth and these nice pieces that have, the seams around the edges and grommets and whatnot, pretty fancy. I think I got it at Costco or something. That is great for my patio where I don't have any plants. And if I look at the label on that, it is 90% shade. So it is not enough lights for our plants to be able to function properly. We want to give them a little bit of relief, but too much shade is not a good thing. So you can see here, this is very light. We can see there's that pattern of the fibers of that shade cloth. We can kind of detect them, but it's still good bright light coming through. That is what's ideal. So focus on covering on the top and on the west facing side. This burlap, even though it seems like a very loose weave, if we were to use one of those light measurement devices, it's not enough candles. So what would happen, as we see here, when our plants grow, where the leaves are attached, those are referred to as node points, and between nodes are inner nodes. Looking at this eggplant, those inner nodes are stretched very long. That's not the way our eggplant should be growing. So we've got these spindly, stretchy stems on the eggplant because there isn't strong enough light coming through. So even though it may seem like good light to us, it's still too heavy. So focus on covering above your plants and on the west facing side. If plants are getting early morning sun, if we flip this bed around, this would be facing east, and that early morning sun is fine. Plants appreciate that. It's still a little cooler in the morning, and having that direct sun is, great for them. When the day heats up and we've got it covered above, and then where the afternoon sun would be coming in, that's the best way to protect our plants. Those structures, support structures that I showed you before. So we could use them for frost cloth in the winter if needed, and certainly we can use them to attach shade cloth to. I don't know why these companies that produce shade cloth have not caught on. What do they think? Gardeners don't like fancy things. All those designer colors that we see, these magnificent shade sails that, here and there around the valley, and those beautiful colors. Those colors aren't available in that 30 to 50% shade range. We have the options of green, kind of a light tan, pale tan color, or black usually for our shade coverings for our plants, but it is what it is. Don't go too deep, don't too heavy for your shade. You'll be swinging too far from too much sun exposure to not enough. You could use some vining plants to offer some midday and afternoon shade. If you planted some gourds or squash plants that are vining, plant them when you plant your spring garden. By the time they start to grow and take off and are covering this support, that would be about the time that your plants that want some shade would be needing it. So it's kind of an ideal, coexisting of your plants.
Here, T. I just want to let you know it's 7 o'clock. I just wanted to let you know what time it was.
Thank you. So mulching, you could use straw. You could use even compost. These things, if you use something such as these organics, you can just turn them, mix them into the soil at the end of the season, and add that as some of your organic matter. But having that buffer that would keep the soil a little cooler and hold that moisture longer, it will benefit your plants. So some of the warm season growers, we have a wide range of squashes. The zucchini plants, a lot of those are kind of bushy growers. They don't trail a lot, but the big thing to remember, sometimes you're overrun with zucchini. You can't, give it away fast enough. And other times you might be thinking, why don't I have any zucchini? With our squash, we need both male and female flowers. They're separate on the plant. And you have to have both of them on the same day for pollination to be affected. So busy bees will come around in the morning, and if you have a male flower, they'll visit it, and then they'll go visit a female flower and rub some of that pollen on it, and then yay, you have a nice little zucchini that starts to develop. If that flower, the female flower, doesn't get pollinated, sometimes if you're not aware, you'll think, oh my gosh, my zucchini, it's got some disease, it's rotting. No, that little zucchini there just didn't get pollinated, so it's just going to wither. So you might need to, burst in and take things into your own hands, so to speak. If you're not getting pollinator, the correct bees, we do have squash bees actually that do our main pollinating for the squashes. So what you want to look for is a male flower that just has a regular stem below the flower, and a female flower that has that little immature fruit that will eventually develop if it gets pollinated. So you look for both of these. The male flower can't develop into anything, just the female. So you could, some people use a paintbrush, but that's like too much work for me. You can just snip the male flower off the plant since it can't develop into anything. And then those are your little squash bees. You can fold the petals back, or I like to just kind of peel them off. And then you take that male flower and very gently, a few dabs of pollen onto the female receptacle, and that's it. Your work is done. One male flower can usually pollinate several females, 3, 4, 5 females at a time. So, but you have to have both of them and get out and do this in the morning when you find both of those flowers. So we have so many types of summer squash. The summer squash has a thin skin. You can't store it for very long. So our zucchinis, crooknecks, all kinds of wonderful tender skinned. And we also have our winter squash. Those are the squash that have a hard shell, and we can store them for maybe a few months or even longer. They're both warm season growers, but that distinguishing between summer squash and winter squash is the tenderness or hardness of that outer skin or shell. So the same thing, male flower, just a simple stem, and the female flower has the little immature plant below the flower. So eat both on the same day, and you can, affect pollination yourself. And with the winter squash, we have a wide range, just as we do with the summer squash. And a lot of these winter squash tend to be more of a vining or trailing plant, so they take up more room in the garden. The spaghetti squash is definitely a winter squash, and here we've got a huge squash hanging from that vine. Our more common acorn and butternut squash. So we can plant these earlier in the season. We can also plant squashes during the monsoon season and then get a later harvest also. They're great for doing that two plantings, successive plantings. Tomatoes, we have to get the tomatoes in early, and that's why some people risk it and plant them as early as February, risking cold weather still. We need to get them growing and flowering before it gets to be 90, 95 degrees. With tomatoes, back up, Kirti. When you're planting your tomatoes, most things you want to maintain the level of soil that we had the plant growing in initially in a container if you're transplanting them. Tomatoes are an exception. You can snip off, these are actually the old cotyledons, some new little leaves starting to branch out here, but you can snip off these lower leaves, just use some nice little garden scissors and cut them off, and you can bury half the stem of a tomato. What happens is there are little adventitious roots. Within the tissue of the stem, you have cells that are just waiting to become roots. And when they're in that moist soil, they'll pop out and you'll have a huge root system develop very rapidly, which gives your tomato plant a lot of gusto, and it can better, go into the warm season. So most often we support our tomatoes because they can get pretty big. Some of our tomatoes are what we call determinate. They remain a bush form, and they pretty much grow, flower, fruit, and that's all kind of, in one cycle. Indeterminate tomatoes tend to get quite large and have a vining type of growth, and they will just kind of keep producing if the temperatures are correct for that. With the flowers, if we're 95 or 100 degrees, the pollen is not viable. Do not waste money on fancy sprays that people will tell you, oh, this will, set the fruit. It won't. When we're that hot, pollen is not viable, so you can't have pollination. The flowers might continue to be produced into the heat of summer, but we won't get any fruits. So we want our tomatoes to grow fast enough that they start flowering, we can get pollination, and then the fruits start to develop. My recommendation is to focus on small to medium-sized tomato fruits. What happens is if we try to grow the larger beefsteak tomatoes, it takes them so long to mature to that big, huge size that usually were really hot by then. With that high temperature, skin tends to get thick, and when the tomato keeps trying to expand and grow, that's when you get these cracks. We can really avoid this by focusing on medium to small size tomatoes. And there are so many types that we can grow within those sizes. So this is the blossom end rot that we discussed yesterday. And there's nothing wrong with eating this. Every once in a while, it will progress into an actual, rot, but just this itself, it's not truly a rot. You can slice this off, that bottom part of the tomato, and eat the rest. That's different than this discoloration here. That is sunburn. We've gotten too hot, and that tomato doesn't have any leaves covering it, so it's exposed and it has suffered sunburn. So now into the heat of summer, the wild and carefree tomatillos are great. They don't care how hot it gets. They can just keep producing through the summer. They're very interesting, beautiful plants. Their flowers and their pollen remain viable, and we can be harvesting through the heat of summer even. So once pollination occurs, you have this little tomato-like fruit that starts to develop, and it will continue to develop in this little papery covering. And eventually it gets so large, it bursts through that, and that's when we know it's time to harvest. Some of them stay fairly small in size. Others can get to be, the size of a medium tomato even. So the tomatillos can grow easily through the heat of summer, as does eggplant. It's generally not affected by the heat as far as pollination. So there are a wide range of eggplant available. This is kind of neat. They have this wire. It's kind of a platform of wire that the plants grow through, and then the fruit sits on top of it, so you don't risk any rotting with it. The fruit's hitting the ground, and it's easier to harvest also. But there are those elongated, skinny Japanese-style eggplant, the more common round eggplant that we find, and there's just some beautiful varieties, the Rosa Bianca. Even white ones, there are some that are small egg-shaped white ones, most likely where the name eggplant originated. So a big variety of eggplants. And just remember, we want them to be firm and shiny skinned when we harvest. They start turning yellow, leave them, don't leave them because we want to remove them to keep the plants more productive. But you can remove these, chop them up, and throw them in the compost. Bell peppers are spring growers. They don't like the heat, and they too will become infertile once we really start to get hot. But a lot of the chili peppers can go into the heat of summer. Not all of them, but a good many of them. And oh my gosh, there are hundreds of types of chili peppers, ranging from fairly mild to the wickedly hot chilies. Cucumbers are spring planters as well, and we have to have the male and female and have the bees do their little thing to affect pollination. And just be aware there are different cucumbers. Some are best for pickling, and others are best for eating fresh, slicing for salads and whatnot. Now, it isn't a true cucumber, but through the summer, we can get just great harvest from Armenian cucumber vines. They can get large, sometimes even like 2 feet in length, and still be tender enough to eat. They're very crisp, fleshed, and very fresh tasting. So even though they're more technically a melon, they do have a very cucumber-like flavor, but they can grow through the heat of summer. Corn we can plant in the spring and the monsoon season. You need to have a block of corn so that the pollen coming from these tassels will be able to sufficiently pollinate the corn. So if you think about your corn ear, every single one of those silks has to be pollinated by a grain of pollen. If any of those silks get missed, that's the empty spot in your corn cob. So having a nice big block is best for that good pollination. Okra doesn't care how hot it gets. It loves the sun, it loves the heat. Even if you detest okra for eating, they are beautiful plants during the summer. They are related to hibiscus. So their flowers are gorgeous, many different types. This is one from Native Seed Search in Tucson. Thick, beefy, wide pods. So we need to harvest okra when it's very young, very tender, definitely before it starts getting woody. There's a thing that, there's such a thing as too much fiber. Look at these lovely flowers that we have with our okra. As I say, they're related to hibiscus, so they have that mallow type flower. Little seedling, the cotyledons, they're so cute. And this is a gorgeous okra, red velvet, that striking color. That color of the fruit with the flowers, just absolutely stunning. And cowpeas, love the heat, love the sun. So this is what happens when school groups plant. You most likely will have to come back through and thin, but you can grow these. They're best with some kind of a support, but they can just spread as a ground cover like plant. You can harvest very, very young, tender pods like this and just snack on them raw in the garden, or let them grow a little bit more and shell them like peas, or you could let those pods fully mature and have your dried black-eyed peas to harvest. And these are Bisbee red black-eyed peas, very colorful. Odom cowpeas are wonderful. Your cotyledons and true seed leaves developing here. This is great because they have lovely pink, kind of pink lavender flowers. The other cowpeas or black-eyed peas have white flowers. So strong summer growers through the heat of summer. Beans, however, spring growing. So get them in early, get them in the spring, and then once we heat up, then that's it. You could plant another round of beans during the monsoon season to be harvesting in the fall. But there's a wide selection of bush beans, and pole beans need support. Doesn't have to be a pole, it can be fencing, but they are best with support of some type. Watermelon, strong growers during the summer, and there are so many types, they need a lot of space. These plants can get huge. This is a very, very tasty yellow meated watermelon. A good one for kids, this is called Stars and Moon. And usually you can't see it on this side, but it's a dark green and you'll see little yellow spots and then usually a round moon on these plants. So many types of watermelon. Odom watermelon that doesn't care how hot it gets, just a really refreshing melon. Cantaloupes, and here's another one from Native Seed Search that is very refreshing, almost like a cross between cucumber and a cantaloupe. So these are great summer growers. Jicama is a beautiful, dense ground cover that towards the end of the season produces lovely lavender color flowers. Now they'll then produce bean-like pods. They are toxic. So the only thing we harvest from our jicama is that tuberous root underground. And you have to have a really nice loose soil to get the big jicama harvest. Otherwise, there'll be these itty bitty little things at the end of the season. Jerusalem artichokes or sunchokes, they develop from a sunflower plant. It's like this big bushy sunflower with kind of small flowers, but they will attract butterflies and pollinators, and then birds will come to eat the small seed at the end of the season. So in the fall, the whole plant will just dry up and die back. That's when you start digging carefully and removing these tubers from underground. They're very crisp and have, to me, it's kind of like a cross between a nut and maybe a cabbage flavor. You can eat it raw or saute it, cook it. Really cool plant. And there are some edible weeds such as purslane, packed with calcium and other vitamins. It's a summer grower. Just make sure you don't mistake it from the milky sapped spurge weed that grows. If you break a stem or the leaves, that milk sap will come out. Do not eat that, but the purslane is very, very nutritious. striped cushaw squash from our southwest here. Beautiful plant. Look at those speckled leaves. The fruit, the squash that develops, some of these are just huge, huge, huge. Wonderful plants, and they will store for a long time unless a squirrel finds it. Why do they have to do that? And I think it went to another one and ate one hole in it. It's like the tomatoes. The birds just peck little holes, one, then the next. And you can plant your corn and squash, and if you have beans to be growing, maybe some cowpeas or something like that, or tepary beans. That's what they call the three sisters. They're compatible for the soil and their stature of growth. So tepary beans are native to the Southwest here. They do not need a super fertile, enriched soil, and they don't want frequent watering. You want to let the soil dry out even a little bit before you water again, because if you water too much, you have a mass of dense foliage and you won't have any flowers, and then fruit pods, the bean pods develop. These are so nutritious, very tasty. There are so many types of tepary beans available through Native Seed Search. Very wonderful for growing here in the desert. They're native in the Southwest. They've been grown by Native peoples here for many, many centuries. So one more thing, amaranth is a warm season grower. We have so many that we can choose from. This is my favorite from Native Seed Search, the Hopi red dye amaranth. Amaranth, you can eat young, tender leaves. Use them as you would spinach. The flowering heads, so spectacular. These little cream spots, those are the actual flowers. All of this are kind of superfluous structures that we refer to as bracts. But the flowers produce very, very tiny seed, not much bigger than poppy seed. And you can use that in different ways. You can cook it for like a cereal, or just put it in a hot skillet and shake it, and you end up with these teeny little, like popcorn-like fun things to eat. But they're beautiful in the garden. So those are, just a few selections of things that we can grow with our cool season and warm season cycles of the year. Remember, you have their planting calendar to help you further sort out the types of vegetables that we can be growing at different times of the year. So here's your quiz question. What season of the year is this harvest basket from? Well, we see some carrots and I think some chard, some leaf lettuce, the dead giveaway for me, cilantro. So that's more so considered an herb, but cilantro only grows in the cool season. We cannot grow it during the summer here. So this is your bounty from the cool season. I hope you've gotten some good ideas and, the basics for gardening here in the desert. I would imagine a lot of you who are with us have done some gardening in other areas. It can be quite a bit different, but still so enjoyable to be gardening. And we can actually be productive in our gardens year round if we choose to be. Even during the monsoon season, if we want to be out in the heat of the summer with our planting and caring for our plants. So thank you very much. And Drew, do we have some questions?
Hi. Yeah, Kirti, thanks again for your presentation. I always love looking at all the different, it makes me hungry every time I watch your presentation. And the sunchokes sounded really good.
Oh, they are, that's a must-have for my recipe for my berry salad.
Yeah, I'll have to definitely try growing some of those. But we do have some questions. The first one I'll ask is, would you grow Romanesca like you would with cauliflower?
Yes, you can. Yes, it is a cool season grower. Yep.
Okay. Next one is, do you clip or pull seedlings to thin them?
Okay, I think I kind of mentioned on the fly, little garden scissors. It is safer, particularly if your seedlings are really, germinating densely. It is safer to clip them. And there are, you can use little snips, or, even just fine pointed scissors to clip them right above the soil level. The reason that I suggest this is better is that if you've got the little seedlings, they're so close to each other, if you pull them, you could damage the little tender roots of the plant you're leaving when you pull up the root system of the plant that you're removing. I would suggest snipping them, cutting them, rather than pulling them. Do we have another question?
Yeah, the next one is, which seed catalogs do you suggest for low desert acclimated veggies?
I would suggest on the handout, your main handout, sorry, I ran away. I was getting my, this is one style of little snips. They have this little, almost like a spring action, so it doesn't tire your hand out. You can use something like this. They have a very, pointed tip. They're nice and sharp. Whatever you're using, make sure they're clean, and they're easy to use. The catalogs, I would say one of my favorites is the Native Seed Search, because they really focus on the plants that have grown here. If not native to our Southwest region, they focus on plants that have been grown here for, typically a few hundred years by people who came up into these areas and brought plant materials with them from other areas of the world. Such as those wonderful toy onions. So we know that they do well in our area. Now, Native Seed Search catalog, they do have designations because they have seed for higher elevation desert regions as well as our low deserts. So they help you sort out which is which. So that's one of my favorites. And any of those seed catalogs that I've listed have some really good quality. It's just the others you want to look for, I'd say, plants that will be quick to mature, and always for the summer season especially, kind of think about, if it says full sun, does that mean for us here that we need maybe some mid-afternoon shade?
And the next question, so we got quite a few questions here. The next one is, do you recommend using shredded paper as mulch?
You could. Now, for mulch around the plants during the summer, that probably isn't the best. I say that because if you shred the paper and it gets wet, it could flatten and compact and actually not let good air circulation get to the soil. If you have something that's coarser, the straw or compost or partially decomposed organic matter, it's looser and lets air get through more easily. But that paper could be used in your pathways to reduce weed seed germination, definitely.
Next question is there a special shade cloth or garden for garden, or the same as window shade screens?
They are different. Overall, I'd say the screening that we use for those, for our windows to reduce the, that heat conductivity or heat penetrating into our homes, it's going to be a little bit different in texture that, you know, the shade cloth that we use in our gardens, it's pretty pliable and very easy to form on frames. So I think there's enough of a difference that I would really focus more on the shade cloth that's intended for the gardens rather than for screens in our homes. But I will confess, I do have some old shade screens from windows that I have, you know, this past summer for some planters, just because, you know, things got so brutal, I did kind of like, you know, perch those to give some of the plants a little shade, but most ideal is to use the garden shade cloth and support it. You definitely need to support that above the plant so that you have good air circulation. You don't want to be blanketing heat in right directly around the plants.
Well, thank you. The next question is, how do you know if there is enough moisture in the soil? Should it look dark/wet throughout the day?
I wouldn't necessarily say that it needs to look dark throughout the day. You might have a little lightning. Water is active in the soil. If there's a good amount of moisture, what happens is it will, you will have evaporation from the top of the soil. But if we have good moisture in the soil, with fluctuations in temperature between the day and the night, it tends to move up and down a little bit. But the best thing is really to feel the soil, feel the moisture within the soil. Hey, we're gardeners. We don't mind getting our fingers in the soil. We should enjoy that.
The next question is, what do you all have to do? What all do you have to do to hand pollinate?
So, you know, you have the handout, a copy of the presentation. And also, if you need a bigger explanation and visuals, go to the Native Seed Search website. And they do have a nice little publication or brochure on pollinating squash plants. And they have some, you know, great photos with that. But in the morning, what you would want to do is go out, find a male flower. And my preference, I think it's easier to just clip that flower and you can kind of bend the petals back, or I peel them from the base of that flower. And just go up to the female plant. You can tell it because it has that real tiny squash right below the flower. Just gently dab pollen from the male onto that center receptacle, the stigma of the female flower. And you can use that male for a few, you know, 3, 4, or 5 different female flowers. But you need to do it in the morning.
Cool. And then the next question is, can we grow leeks or shallots?
Yes, yes. They would be cool season growers. And leeks, they do very well here, but you want a nice fertile soil. And especially here in the desert, it's important as they're growing. I think it's a good idea to kind of mound, keep mounding some compost around them as they're, you know, elongating to keep the base of it nice and white and tender. But yeah, and we can grow the shallots also. Cool season growers.
Mm-hmm. And then I'll ask this one since, well, let's do this one. Can tomato plants grow successfully through fall into winter? Grape tomatoes.
As long as you're willing to protect them if we get cold in the fall or winter, you can grow tomatoes. So I didn't focus on that, but they won't produce during the summer. If you care to have them take up space in your garden and be using the water, you can keep them growing during the summer. And if they're that indeterminate, especially, you can cut them back to maybe about 12 or 18 inches, and around August. and that will stimulate a lot of fresh new growth. They will be prime when we start cooling off a little bit to be flowering, and we're getting cooler instead of hotter. So those flowers will definitely get pollinated then. And you can, be showing off your harvest to your friends who are under snow in more northern climates, in December and January. But you will have to most likely cover them, protect them from cold at least a few times during the winter. That's the main thing, is to, keep them from freezing.
And the next one is, when would you recommend cover crops? I am a winter resident. How do I protect the garden during summer?
So cover crops can be wonderful in helping to prevent or reduce germination of weeds in your garden. And you can perhaps throw out a cover crop before you leave for the season, and let them grow through the summer. The cowpeas are wonderful cover crops. They not only, you're going to plant, you're not planting like we would to grow full plants and harvest. With your cover crops, you want a thick, dense planting. So it takes a lot of seed, but you can just let them grow. And even though they're going to get larger and, go through a cycle even before you get back in the, at the end of the summer or early in the fall, it's still going to be good. You knocked out those weeds, kept them from germinating, and you can still use them, till part of that cover into the soil, but then you do need to wait, ideally wait for several weeks once you've cut those greens and then incorporate it into the soil before you plant. You could just use them kind of as a half useful cover crop, and then just, cut them all off when you get back, and then maybe chop it up and throw it in your compost, not necessarily working it directly into the soil. And there are other things that are available, different plants for different seasons, especially for cover crops here in our desert. But that, could be a great thing. Mm-hmm. Definitely.
All right, we got 2 questions left. The next one is, with the heat in the fall, is the temperature a determining factor for fall planting?
For some plants, definitely. For others, for others, such as chard, they're pretty easy going, and we could even plant them in September. We probably would need to give them a little shade initially, but there are some things that aren't so obsessed with the temperatures. Other plants, they have to have a range of temperatures to get going, and I did not include that. I don't think that's included in the planting calendar that you have, but you can access that information pretty easily on the website. And then definitely, if you're looking at seed catalogs, they will indicate, or your seed packet will indicate, there is an ideal range of temperature. They'll let you know.
Cool. Last question is, my radishes and jalapenos are always so hot, sometimes too spicy to eat. Am I doing something wrong?
So did you say radishes and jalapenos?
Yeah, the radishes and jalapenos.
Okay. I kind of think of jalapenos as, fairly hot anyway. Radishes, there are some that have a little bit more mild flavor. You might want to try some different varieties. Flip through some seed catalogs and see what their descriptions are for some of the different radishes, because it might be that whatever you're growing is just one of those that has that hotter, spicier flavor. But other than that, I don't know particularly anything that we're doing would very much impact the heat that the harvest would produce.
Awesome. And I think that's it. We have a couple people that said thank you so much for the presentation. I've learned so much. Thank you for both great presentations. She is so very knowledgeable. And thank you, Kirti, for another outstanding presentation. We really do appreciate it. I just want to thank everyone for attending the workshop today. Here, as you can see, we have the city and town websites for more information, resources, or contact information. We have one last workshop for the fall, which is our butterfly gardening class this coming Tuesday. I just want to let you know about that. And then when you close out of this WebEx, you'll have a brief survey about tonight's class. Both Chandler and Queen Creek would appreciate it if you just take a minute to complete it so we can use it to improve our classes in the future. Thank you again, and hope everyone has a great evening.
Thank you, everybody.